I am the director of Race and Faith, and you have joined this lecture series that we started earlier this year called What is it and Why Does It Matter? I started doing this lecture series because I wanted to cover a range of topics that I thought was important and people wanted to really get into. So we started with critical race theory. We did a lecture on white supremacy and radicalization. We also did a lecture on exploring uh, black maleness and what does it mean to develop in to a black man in today's time and society. And now we are to, we also did a lecture on fair housing. And now we are to this lecture tonight, which I'm super excited to listen to and get into because we have a fantastic presenter, an educator, a man with a heart for justice, and also a minister preacher, which I know because he is a minister preacher, he will bring some of his preaching flair, but he won't have us here all night long. So I will allow Pastor Fred to share as much about himself as he would like to, but I know you are in for a treat. So I invite you to give your full attention to Pastor Fredrick Robinson as he shares with us his lecture on Black liberation and theology. But it's not only that, it is his own academic learnings and the ways he's going to invite us to think about liberation theology and what it means for us today. There will be time for you to share in questions a little bit later. So we welcome you to start your lecture and enlighten us, Pastor Robinson.
Thank you. Thank you, Rhonda, for inviting me to deliver this lecture. And thank you for all the important work that you do at Race and Faith. And thank all of you for participating tonight. And it is my prayer that you get a lot out of this discussion. And I look forward to any questions that you may have. The topic of my lecture this evening is what I call Black Theodic theology. Black Theodic theology. I will define that term later in this lecture. But before I do, allow me to kind of introduce myself. I imagine myself as a kind of liberation process relational theologian who is drawn to Black theology in the tradition of James Cone and later Black theologians, later generations of Black theologians, as well as to this Eastern Orthodox concept called Theosis. And so as I place these two concepts in conversation with each other, I've come up with what I call Black Theodic theology. I'll first attempt to talk about Black theology, and then I'll discuss theosis, and attempt to show you how I put the two in conversation with each other. Though Black theology was formalized by James Cone in the late 1960s, its roots really go all the way back to slavery when Blacks began to use religion as a tool of coping as well as an instrument of emancipation. It was this new religion, though twisted by whites to control the enslaved, that sustained them in the face of hardship and gave them hope for a brighter day. While many Blacks embraced what scholars call slave religion, history attests to the fact that independent theological thought began to germinate among the enslaved early on in that peculiar institution. The desire for independence from the twisted theological teachings of white slave masters made the creation of the Black church necessary. Blacks longed for the kind of worship and religion that responded to their needs in a free and safe environment. It was in some of those early safe environments that they were reminded that they were children of the Most High God who had inherent rights. And in part because of these secret meetings, some of them became radicals. In fact, Nat Turner, a Congregationalist preacher, led one of the most violent insurrections against slave owners in 1831. Such uprisings called a slave owner to exclaim in horror, "The slaves are plotting, the Negroes have risen." In light of this powerful impact on the enslaved community, many southern states began to curtail missionary activities. They doubled down on restrictions on reading, and they tried to prevent certain blacks from preaching. But it was too late. A fire had already been lit, and there was no turning back. Because even when the enslaved had to worship in secret, they did so. Hymns, such as "Still Away," cryptically alerted them of clandestine worship meetings being held in the hush harbors away from the earshot of slave owners. It was because of the hope that religion gave them that many later founded institutions of learning. They started businesses, they opened hospitals, provided insurance policies, started burial and benevolent societies, and even entered politics. It was that same spirit of liberation that led to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. According to theologian and historian Gaylord Wilmore, formal black theology developed out of the Black Power movement in the 1960s and was officially formalized when James Cone, the father of black theology, published his seminal work, Black Theology and Black Power, in 1969. So what is black liberation theology? Before answering that question, it's important to state the obvious, at least obvious to me, that what you see in most black churches today is not black liberation theology. The theology that permeates most black places of worship today is practically indistinguishable from mainstream white evangelicalism. Despite the roots of black liberationist thought throughout black history, there were many churches, if not most, that adopted the theology of the majority culture. James Cone believes a shift occurred after the Civil War, with post-Civil War black churches becoming more accommodationist than those that existed during the pre-Civil War era. In fact, such a shift made it necessary to formalize a doctrine of black liberation theology. Black theology then can be defined by this 1969 statement from the National Committee of Black Churchmen. This is the definition. Black theology is a theology of black liberation. It seeks to plumb the black condition in light of God's revelation in Jesus Christ, so that the black community can see that the gospel is commensurate with the achievement of black humanity. Black theology is a theology of blackness. It is the affirmation of black humanity that emancipates black people from white racism, thus providing authentic freedom for both white and black people. It affirms the humanity of white people in that it says no to the encroachment of white oppression. End quote. I won't attempt to go through all of the tenets of black theology, but here's what James Cone believes. Cone says this: God talk is not Christian talk unless it is directly related to the liberation of the oppressed. And that's from A Black Theology of Liberation. Let me repeat that once again. God talk is not Christian talk unless it is directly related to the liberation of the oppressed. Cone goes further. He says this: if your theological concepts on atonement and salvation is not going to eliminate what's happening to helpless poor people, then I say it is not the gospel. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., considered one of the black liberation theologians, put it this way. He says, any religion that professes to be concerned with the souls of men and is not concerned with the slums that damn them the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them is a dry as dust religion. Now, some believe that Cone's declaration that God is black is too divisive. But I believe that's a misunderstanding. When Cone talks about whiteness and blackness, in a way, he's not really talking about ethnicities, but worldviews. In other words, Cone believes that being white in America means having a particular worldview, one that tends to view life from the prism of privilege and assumed freedom. Usually, that means that there's little focus on liberation, since liberation has not been the need of whites. On the other hand, since Cone views God as a liberator, and since he believes that genuine Christianity sides with the poor and the oppressed, the only way for white Christians to be genuine is to reject whiteness, which is privilege, and adopt blackness, which is liberation. In a black theology of liberation, Cone says blackness is an ontological symbol for all people who participate in the liberation of man from oppression. Now, understood in this way, blackness can be adopted by anyone of any race who fights on behalf of the oppressed and thus takes a stand against whiteness. Accordingly, black theology provides a needed challenge to white evangelicalism, reminding the church that it is not enough to simply save souls while ignoring the structural machinery in society that keeps the wheels of injustice rolling on. Cone says black theology is to make Christianity really Christian by moving black people with a spirit of dignity and self-determination so that they can become what the Creator intended for them to become. Black liberation theological anthropology, listen, it's not simply about the full humanity of blacks, but in a real sense, it's also about the full humanity of whites. Once again, Cone says this: Christ, in liberating the wretched of the earth, also liberates those responsible for the wretchedness. The oppressor is also freed from his particular demons. Black power shouts yes to black humanness and no to white oppression as it exercises demons on both sides of the conflict. In other words, those who maintain and benefit from racist structures also need to be freed in order to walk in their full humanity before God. The main strength of black theology, in my mind, lies in its refusal to gloss over suffering and oppression, and in its articulation of how those unfortunate realities continue to mar the body of Christ, which claims to be an instrument of love. And it is these concepts of black theology that I place in conversation with Theosis. That's my own theological approach called Black Theotic theology. But why do I put these in conversation with each other? Because I believe that what God offers what offers us in salvation is deeper and more extensive than is usually articulated in the Western church. I believe closer to the real beauty, the real richness and complexity of what the writer of Hebrews calls so great a salvation includes this concept called theosis. Theosis is the transliteration of the Greek word meaning deification. It is the process of being made one with God. It is the teaching that we are not just saved from sin in the juridical sense that enables us to go to heaven when we die, but that we, in a personal sense, are invited to share in the union of the Godhead now. Father David Hester, in his booklet, The Jesus Prayer, defined theosis this way: it's the gradual process by which a person is renewed and unified so completely with God that he or she becomes by grace what God is by nature. Salvation, according to Orthodox theology, is not a static state of being, but a process of becoming. Unlike the Western concept of salvation, theosis is not a once and for all event, but it is a lifelong journey walking with God. At Maya Angelou's funeral, her pastor shared this wonderful anecdote. He said anybody who went up to Maya Angelou proudly declaring themselves as a Christian would always get this response from her: already? I'm still working on it. Angelou's deeply theological response captures a key teaching of theosis because it contends that believers are always in a perpetual state of working out their salvation in fear and trembling. Or as Carrie Day declares in Religious Resistance to Neoliberalism, we're not yet saved. And with that in mind, allow me to make the argument that viewing salvation through the lens of Black Theodic theology can help us construct a more robust doctrine of social justice in Western theology because of these three key things. Number one, it's inherently praxis-oriented. Perhaps the greatest goal of theosis was articulated by the 7th century monk Maximus the Confessor. Maximus said the goal of theosis is to become all God is, except ontologically. And since God's character is one of justice, love, and mercy, listen, one cannot participate in a holy God and not be repulsed by injustice in any of its myriad forms and isms: racism, genderism, heterosexism, or Trumpism. And to participate in God is another way of saying that we take on the righteousness of God and thus becomes God's instruments of fidelity and mercy in a troubled and benighted world. As such, theosis has the ability to renew Western understandings of salvation and shift the focus from believers just being made right with God to being made partners with God in renewing the earth. Traditional evangelicalism has generally promulgated the idea that the world is a wrecked vessel, so the church's job is to get people on board on the right ship before it's too late. However, such thinking places the primary focus on saving souls rather than bodies. It has also led to a religious culture where people are more likely to say they believe in God rather than live lives that reflect the character of God. And theosis can serve as a corrective. And it does because it helps us see that we're not just saved from something, but that we're saved for something. And as such becomes what Sean Copeland calls the enfleshed exegesis of the gospel. John Wesley was right. There is no holiness except social holiness. Number two, it's grounded in an optimistic anthropology. Let me say it again. It's grounded in an optimistic anthropology. Consider the biblical basis for theosis. Common passages used by Orthodox theologians include Genesis 1, Genesis 3, 1st, 2nd Peter 1, as well as many others. In the 1st and 3rd chapters of Genesis, men and women are made in the image of God and the likeness of God. But because of the fall, according to theosis, humanity lost the likeness of God but retained the image of God. Orthodox theologians argue that theosis is the best explanation for how believers can regain the likeness of God that was lost. According to Athanasius, God's response to the fall was to become human so that humans could become God. 2 Peter 1 and 4 says, it speaks of believers participating in the divine nature of God. The Greek word participate means to become sharers of. And so by participating in the divine nature of God through grace, obedience, and faith, in other words, by intimidating God's goodness, we regain the likeness of God. According to Theosis, Jesus came to show us the way. Therefore, we're not just called to believe in Jesus. We're ordered to become like Jesus. Now, keep in mind, reading the Bible through theodic lenses leads to an important departure from the anthropological pessimism of Western soteriology, best illustrated in that Pelagian controversy of the 5th century. Born out of that intellectual and ideological dispute was a complex debate over human nature, the consequences of the fall, the necessity of divine grace and salvation, and freedom of the will that still reverberates today. The debate involved two key thinkers, Augustine of Hippo and the British monk Pelagius. At the center of the dispute was Pelagius' optimistic contention that human beings, through their own efforts, could live virtuous and moral lives. Augustine, considered the father of Western theology, countered that the fall left humanity deeply wounded and corrupted. A believer in monogism, the idea that God works alone in salvation, Augustine argued that Adam's sin rendered humanity incapable of lifting itself from spiritual death. Augustine, of course, won the debate, and Augustinism, which influenced Calvinism, became the dominant understanding in the West. But Eastern soteriology was less pessimistic than Augustinianism and argued that humanity could assent to God and moral behavior, for while the image of God was marred after the fall, it was not completely destroyed. Though there are some different Eastern theological schools of thought on the matter, the concept of theosis was more synergistic, meaning that believers played a role in salvation and in becoming more like God. Now, this is important because over time, the Western church came to view the requirement of social justice as a type of work that denigrated the finished work on the cross. Humanity, many Western theologians argue, could add nothing to salvation. So generally speaking, any notion of the significance of human involvement, a rejection of what Jürgen Moltmann called the political hermeneutics of the gospel regarding salvation, was rejected by theologians in the West, which led to a problematical tendency to focus on personal and individual salvation to the exclusion of social and structural evil. This has long been a dangerous narrowing of the gospel that continues to this day to distort the Christian witness. And I haven't even talked about how racism, manifest destiny, American exceptionalism, and racial capitalism codified this doctrine in order to spread and normalize white supremacy. Then number 3, finally, theosis is about human flourishing. It's about human flourishing. Western theology raises the question, how can the unsaved become saved? But Black Theodic theology raises the question, how can non-persons be made persons who are free to be all that God called them to be? Let me repeat that. Western theology focuses on how the unsaved can become saved, but Black Theodic theology raises the question, how can non-persons meaning those who are oppressed, those who are marginalized, how can those non-persons be made persons who are free to become all that God called them to be? In this way, Black Theodic theology provides the imagination to eradicate socio-political and economic boundaries as people of all stripes and classes are invited to participate as equal partners in the Godhead, as a community of equals without domination. Also consider incarnation. In Black Theodic theology, it is argued that in the incarnation, Jesus radically entered the world in identification with those on the margins of society. And that was what the incarnation was about, that Jesus coming on the side of the oppressed. Andrew Draper, in his book, A Theology of Race and Place, argues that in theosis, marginalized persons are divinized within the canonic flesh of Jesus. J. Cameron Carter sharpens the point in his book, Race, a Theological Account, by postulating that in the incarnation, God uses Jesus' birth into poverty to destroy divisions based on class and ethnicity. In other words, in theosis, God flips the script and makes the first the last and the last first. All of us are called in this understanding of theosis to participate in the economy of God's salvation. But God, understand, has a preferential option for those who are on the margins of society. Let me say that again. All of us are called to participate in God's economy of salvation. All of us are saved, but God does have a preferential option for those who are on the marginalized or who are on the margins of society. Carter says this, and I quote, he says, God enters into the heart of those who suffer so that from inside those hurts, being fully identified with them to the point of communicating his divinity through them, he heals them. It is the poor slave, one might say, who is closest to God and so reveals God. I love that. In other words, God is not revealed in lives of the money elite and the powerful, but God is revealed in the lives of the least of these, the poor, the suffering, the rejected, the despised, and the marginalized. Understood in this way, Theosis unites us intimately to the poor and their struggles because God is where the poor are. Finally, Theosis has inherent spiritual practices that liberate. In my reformulated concept of Theosis, spiritual practices achieve what is called conscientization, which is defined as a moment of insight which creates suspicion about oppression. Conscientization is when the oppressed themselves have a moment of insight about the oppression that they are facing, and it inspires them and it awakens them to do something about it. In Black Theodic theology, spiritual practices not only provide healing for people, but they also conscientize them to the social conditions that contribute to their brokenness. As many womanist theologians have taught us, Christ doesn't just heal sickness, but Christ also addresses the social conditions that make people sick. In conclusion, Jesus in John 14:12 declared that even greater things than these shall believers perform. I contend these things include working with God to create a world free from the scourges of racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, Trumpism, white supremacy, and other poisonous ideas that have thwarted humanity's rise to God. In Black Theodic theology, we are reminded of our call to partner with God in creating a better world. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of those willing to be co-workers with God. Perhaps we haven't transformed the world because we're waiting on a God who is waiting on us to be her instruments of love, justice, and mercy in the world, waiting on us to realize that we are called to be partakers of the divine nature, or in the words of St. Gregory, waiting on us to realize that we have been ordered to become God. Amen.
Amen. You gave a lot. That was a full 30 minutes for sure. Thank you so much. And we have a couple comments in the chat box that I will read. It was one question in particular, and if you have questions or comments you want to make, please do place them in the chat box, and we will get to them. So there's one: how is Black liberation theology different from liberation theology that arose in South America?
I don't know, to be honest, how much different it is, except contextually. Sometimes people say that Gutierrez, Gustavo Gutierrez, is the founder of liberation theology, but his work actually came after James Cone in 1960. His work came in 1970 after James Cone, and they were often in communication with each other. The framework of liberation theology in South America, Latin America, is very similar to Black liberation theology. Those two are in conversation. I don't know if I can pinpoint any differences, because I'm not a scholar of Latin American liberation theology, although I read much of it to the extent that I can say, well, this is different and that is different. They are really rooted in the same soil. They grow from the same place. Obviously, many theologians have different concepts, and there are many generations. James Cone, first generation, you had second, third, and fourth generation black theologians, and the same is true of liberation theology in Latin America, that you have people who built upon, question, strengthen, and challenge certain tenets. And I think they all flow from the same stream. I would answer that way.
Okay. We have another question here from, that question was from Miss Terry, and this one is from Miss Marquesa Tucker Harris. Why do you think Black people have not come to the understanding or embrace Black liberation theology?
Because we are victims of our culture. In America, a lot of people don't understand that the way we do theology has a lot to do with our own social location. We have bought into this myth that there's an objective way to do theology. And so because we exist in America, the dominant theology has been suspicious. Well, I wouldn't even say suspicious. I would say dismissive of Black theology. And so because, as I said in the lecture, what is practiced in most Black churches today is not Black liberation theology. It's almost identical to white evangelical theology. And because of that, it impacts, this is the culture in which we live. And so we see Black theology as something different, as contextual. It's hard to get out of our culture. Black theology is somewhat considered divisive. There's the argument that Christianity is bigger than liberation. One statement that is often made by many Blacks who reject Black theology is this: if liberation of Black people was important to God, then why aren't we liberated? That's a curious statement, but I've heard that so many times. And so for them, God's main concern is heaven when you die. And that God is not as concerned about the liberation of the oppressed on this side of the Jordan, but God is concerned about where we will spend eternity after we die. And so that confuses the matter. But that question is weird to me. If liberation was God's major concern, which Black liberation theology argues, then why aren't we liberated? But you can ask that about anything. If good marriages was God's concern, why more than 50% of marriages end in divorce? If holiness was God's concern, why aren't many Christians holy? So I think it's a silly question, and that gets to why I added Theosis to my idea of Black theology, because Theosis answers that question. Theosis says it is our responsibility to liberate. God gives us the blueprint, but it's up to us as people, as humans, to exercise and make liberation real in our lives, in our world. It's the same thing about anything. We have a responsibility as disciples of Christ to bring God's vision to earth. The idea that God is going to do it for us is, I think, a misunderstanding of the gospel. God empowers us. God works through us. God inspires us to do liberation. And to the extent we think it's secondary to, saving souls, we don't do that work. I hope that answers your question.
Well, she says, "Oh man, amen," in the chat box, and just to piggyback on that a little bit, you didn't get deeper into the whole notion of white supremacy, as you mentioned, you said not to get into manifest destiny, capitalism, white supremacy, and how all those ideas fold into it. Because if you think about it, and maybe some of those messages back in plantation was more like, let me that soul focus, right? Let me get your soul saved, because you're
Right.
never gonna be free. You ain't
Right.
gonna. That's not the point. The
Right.
point is never for you to be free, and we already know why that was so, right? Because they
Right.
needed them to remain captive for their own capitalistic gains. And so then you get that twisted messaging of what people really think Christianity is about, which doesn't go towards this. What I hear you saying, in a lot of ways, we embody all that God called us and created us to be. And I think what you wrapped up on your last point about this thing about persons, and how do you help persons become who God called them or destined them to be? How do you help them get into that liberatory space, which take the focus off of thinking about saving a soul from hell damnation, which is an obsession, I think, of American culture, because we're focused on meritocracy. We get into that merit base. Oh, but you didn't earn it. You need to
Yeah.
earn it, so then you go. So I think that plays a little bit into it, as well as this rejection of Black liberation theology. Because I think for myself, I wasn't introduced to that idea until I was practically in seminary,
Right.
and I was in my 30s.
Right.
So I think for a lot of us, I think it's just not even familiar to people.
Right.
It
Absolutely.
has a lot of theological themes, okay, for Christians in general in the United States.
Right.
It's a lot of stuff you can go into about the way we do. But
Right.
it's another question here, because I don't want to start getting too deep into my own thing here. Where does the suffering servant fit in?
Yeah. In Isaiah, or some consider Jesus the fulfillment of that. So, I'll let me see if I can answer this straightforward as possible, because there's so many roads I can go down. But Dolores Williams problematized glorifying suffering for good reason. Some people have considered that it's Christian to suffer. But I think put in right perspective in terms of oppressed people, it is understanding. If you're talking about the suffering servant, it is the cross. Let me try to put it in terms of the cross. James Cone talks about this. He's saying the cross is failure, but God transformed the cross into success. He uses this scripture. He said the only way you gain your life is by losing it, but he says for the sake of the oppressed. And so when you're talking about with suffering servant, and how that speaks to us, I believe, is that that as privileged people, see, a lot of times these concepts should be used on privileged people, not poor people. Remember, Christ was privileged, Son of God, privileged. But he gave up that privilege, right, to die for the sins of the world. And so often we try to make suffering, or the concept of suffering servant, somehow the work of poor people, oppressed people, when in really it's the work of the powerful class, the elites, that you give up your privilege in order to open the doors to other people. And so I think we abuse concepts by trying to say, well, poor people, you should continue to suffer because Jesus suffered. No, it's the privileged class that needs to give up. The Bible says if you seek to save your life, you lose it. But if you lose your life for the sake of the gospel, you gain it. And so those who are privileged, those who got money, those who got security, those who have access, you have to put those at risk, suffering. You have to put those at risk to suffer with those who are oppressed. And I answer it that way because, and one thing I would say, Jesus said this. He said, Jesus reinterpreted scripture. He said, you have heard it said, but I say. And so he was trying to get people back to the right concepts, because remember, we should interpret the Bible through the spirit of the law, not the letter. The letter heals, but the spirit gives life. And the spirit of the gospel is the gospel of love and inclusion and the release of the oppressed. That was Jesus' mission statement, Luke 4:18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor and open the sight eyes of the blind and to preach deliverance to the captives. We have to put the Bible in conversation with other parts of the Bible to understand what is the redemptive spirit of the text. What is God really all about? And I think God is all about love and inclusion and the release of people from bondage, spiritual and physical. And so often white America always think they're the hero of the story. We don't interpret. I don't think the dominant culture interprets the Bible enough as a challenge to their station in life. So they're always trying to figure out some spiritual aspect of how it can be applied to poor people and other people while they continue to hold on to their privilege. But often those concepts is a challenge to those in power. How do you suffer with the oppressed? What are you willing to give up?
She made a mention of Philippians 2. Did you want to speak more about that, Terry? Or is that enough?
I would love for her to. So
See if I can. Okay. Unmute video. Here I am. Okay.
Right.
As you were talking, I really asked the question because about the suffering servant from Isaiah, of course, and Jesus's model, the cross, and the cross then is transformed. But if you go back to Philippians 2, you talked about Jesus. Jesus, although he was the Son of God, came to us. He gave up that status and came to us as a suffering for our sakes. So he brought back into God, which is what my image was of the Trinity, of being drawn into the Trinity, which I think capsulizes what you were talking about. So that's why I raised Philippians 2.
Which verse?
Philippians 2. Oh, I don't have my Bible in front of me.
7, maybe 7.
Yeah.
6 and 7. Who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery
Right.
to be equal with God,
Right.
but made himself of no reputation, and took upon the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And I was talking about the incarnational aspect of God, right? That
Yeah.
Christ comes down. Christ doesn't come down just to identify with the poor. Christ comes as the poor.
Right.
And the cross is solidarity with the oppressed. That's what the cross is. It's no to war, the culture of war and domination and all of that, but it's in solidarity to the oppressed. But God transforms the cross into victory. And so that when we suffer, when we fight for the rights of the poor and the oppressed, even though we may suffer with them, in the end, victory comes for all of us.
Right.
So yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for that question.
Welcome.
And Rhonda, any other questions? I think. Oh, there she is.
Here. At the moment, I don't see any other questions in the chat box. We have about 8 minutes left. If anyone else had any thoughts or comments you would like to share. I know for myself.
Yeah.
Oh,
I was going to say, I was looking at Terry's, when your understanding of theosis reminds me of the icon of the Trinity, where we are beckoned to enter into the Trinity. I like that because that is theosis. Theosis saying the love and the community and the relationship between members of the Trinity we are invited to participate in that union. And I didn't mention that specifically in the lecture, but that exactly what captures it. That God
Pastor
invites us.
Craig,
Yeah,
read that comment out loud in full so everybody can
Yeah.
have reference to what you're speaking about.
you mean Terry's comment?
Yeah, that you're talking about now.
Okay. Terry's comment is this. It says, your understanding of theosis reminds me of the icon of the Trinity, where we are beckoned to enter into the Trinity. That's the statement, and that is exactly what theosis does. It is believed that in creation, when it says, let us make man, the us refers to the Trinity. And that was an invitation for humanity to enter the relationship in the Trinity between the three persons of the Trinity, which right reflects mutuality with no domination, a community of equals with no domination. And as we enter into that relationship, we are to reflect that relationship of mutuality with no domination in our relationship with each other.
As I'm watching and looking at the um, hearings about January 6th, which shows we have a serious problem with domination, right? You always
Absolutely.
over and against, always want to have that power. You talked about Trumpism a lot, or you mentioned that, and I was just, even just that it is a such thing as Trumpism that we have to address today, in light of where we are now as a society here in the United States. What is it that you think is most important for, I would say, the Christian church, but expressly, I think the Black Christian church, for us now, given these times, and the ways, I think, for me, particularly the way Black liberation theology can really, and what you your Black theodic
Yeah.
theology, the way that that really can help us through this uh, political season, especially as we head towards 2024 and the red wave that is coming.
How it can help us?
Out, yes.
It's very difficult because and when I say that, because when you look at Trumpism, right, it's an irrational belief in, rooted in white supremacy, and it's based on a deformed epistemology in terms of about whiteness. It's hard to reach. I'll be honest. It's hard to reach them. I think the best way we can reach them is to um, is
Well, and you know
to
what? I'm not even thinking about reaching them.
yeah.
I mean, I guess it is some blacks that follow Trumpism for sure, but that's a
Yeah.
small
There
minority.
are some.
Yeah,
Herschel Walker,
yeah,
Tim
for
Scott.
sure.
I'd say Tim Scott, but Clarence Thomas. I
Candace
think
Owens. Yeah, it's definitely uh, a small section of blacks that
so.
follow that. But yeah,
So the
go ahead.
reason I was trying to answer that way, because I
I'm
think that needs
sorry.
to be dealt with. But now, if you mean how can it help Black people, that's a sort of a different question. Um,
Yeah,
you
like
know,
for us, and thinking of, you know, so many, I guess, and part of this is just thinking about so many black people that I know are, they're not finding a home in Christianity
right.
anymore. I think because, in a lot of ways, because of the whiteness and the white supremacy, and people are waking up to that. And of course, a whole lot of other false ideas about what it means to be Christian and what people think that is. But it's some parts, I think, for people who feel really pro-black, and I think, and James Coney spoke to that himself, this pro-blackness and how you have to wrestle with being pro-black and Christian. But I think so in this political landscape right now, where I can totally see white supremacy at work, and knowing that for me, my belief in Christianity, it anchors me, and the ideas that I have helps me to get past and keep fighting
Right.
against
Let
this
me let me try
oppression.
to
Go ahead.
answer that question. So I do think it provides a space for people who are disaffected with the church, people who believe the church is too much about materialism, and too otherworldly, focusing on heaven. People who have walked away from the church because they no longer believe in the traditional doctrine that has been taught, that they consider it too narrow, they consider it's too material. They're concerned that it doesn't focus on social justice. So for those people, and that's one of the things we're working on at my church. For those people, it offers a church and theological practices that they can buy into. Those people who think the church is too homophobic, too sexist, too racist, too capitalistic, it offers a space for those people to come back into the faith and embrace a theology that they can believe in, that's focused on justice, that's focused on radical inclusion in that way. Also, we're working to I'm trying to figure out ways, how can I reach traditional black thinkers in terms of Christianity, those who embrace pretty much white evangelicalism, right? Pretty much of those who don't see the gospel in social terms, pretty much who still privilege, souls over bodies. How can we reach those? And that's the work that I'm trying to do in the space I'm in. How can I do that? Through Bible study, through personal relationships, through so many ways. How can you switch, right, the mindset? And I think one of the things, as I said earlier, and I can't quite articulate as well as I want to, but one of the barriers we have to knock down is this notion that there's this objective way to do theology. We have to understand that we bring our social locations to the table. And I think if we can understand that, if we can really get that, then I think we'll be more able to deconstruct what we believe and reconstruct it in a more liberative way.
All right
You
then. Well, thank you so much for this thoughtful presentation. I mean, we can tell by the library you got in back of you that you don't do nothing but read books and things.
know.
Of course, you make time for prayer too.
Of course.
But I just thank you so much, and it's a thank yous coming through the chat box as well. I look forward to our continued work together in ways that we all can do our part to hold up the ways our faith, because race and faith is really not about giving anybody any particular dogma to follow, but it is saying that you believe something.
Yeah.
And how is your belief system either helping you fight against racial oppression, or how is it helping you to oppress others? And so I think it's very important for us to look at our religious beliefs and ideologies and get a deeper and better understanding of what we believe, why we believe it, and how does it help us, especially us folks who consider ourselves to be freedom loving. How is our faith helping us to do that? And so, with this being Juneteenth week, I call this our season of liberation. We're celebrating Black liberation on this Sunday. I just thought that this topic was fitting to really looking at Black liberation theology and really looking at faith and the ways it can liberate us if we allow it, but it can also hold us back and oppress us. So I just thank you for this illuminating conversation. Thanks for you all watching on social media. Thank you for those who joined us right here live and now. We sure appreciate you. If you would like to give a donation for this series, you are more than welcome to do that. You can make a donation at raceandfaith.org. Your donation will help us continue doing this type of work. We are in the midst of preparing for our Black Joy Retreat that is happening July 1st through the 3rd, and continuing with those types of offerings and celebrations because it's hard out here. And I always say Black folks need a break. And so so much of my work doing race and faith has been about educating and providing opportunities of learning for white people. And I've really, over the last couple years, have tried to create space in ways that I can attend to people of color and the things that we need to get through this racial trauma that we all experience and deal with together. So when you make a donation to Race and Faith, you're supporting our work to provide care, love, and dignity to other people of color. The Black Joy Retreat is specific just to Black folks, but I also have a project called the Sankofa Box, where I'll give what I basically call it a hug in a box. I give those boxes out, and that goes to any person of color, and includes products in there from local Black owned or businesses of color around the area, also with information about racial trauma, grief, and mental health, just encouraging people of color to take care of themselves and to honor how they feel, and to know that we here at Race and Faith, we see you, we love you, want to support you. So feel free to give us a donation, and we appreciate you, and have a very good night.
Bless you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.